Today on Building the Open Metaverse.
Having worked in publishing with so many game studios, the vast majority of the time is just spent talking about problems rather than focusing on solutions. And I strongly believe that so many teams would have dramatically higher rates of success if they can just fix that about their culture.
Welcome to Building the Open Metaverse, where technology experts discuss how the community is building the open metaverse together. Hosted by Patrick Cozy and Mark Petit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Building the Open Metaverse Season 6, the podcast that showcases the community of artists, developers, researchers, executives, and entrepreneurs who are building the Internet of tomorrow. Today, we have a very, very special guest, Joseph Kim, GK, also known as GK, a gaming industry veteran and seasoned entrepreneur. So GK has had an impressive career spanning over 2 decades working at major companies like Sega, FunPlus, and NBC. However, his true passion lies in the startup world, where he has co-founded multiple game studios, including Lila Games, his latest venture focused on developing shooter games. GK is known for his relentless work ethic, brutal honesty, and iconoclastic views on workplace culture. He is no stranger to controversy, and his outspoken nature has sparked debates around topics like remote work, personal sacrifice for career ambitions, and what it really takes to build a successful startup. So we're super happy to have you with us, Joseph, today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Sounds like you've done a little bit of homework in terms of some of the topics I've spoken about.
You made my work easy. You have so much content you've been creating. We'll come to that. Your newsletters, your blog, and your podcast. So it's really fantastic. But first, our tradition on this podcast is for you to us your journey to the metaverse and where you are today in your own words.
I went to UC Berkeley, studied electrical engineering, computer science, so had a fairly technical background. I started off working at companies like Lawrence Berkeley National Labs in their distributed computing group, and then at Cisco working on networking software. And from there, I kind of shifted to try and start a company in Korea very early on, early internet days. And so I guess my career has been kind of like a winding path. What did I do after that? So after Cisco, tried to start a company. Then, I went into management consulting, worked at a firm called the McKenna Group, most well known for a couple of partners, Regis McKenna, who did some early work at Apple, as well as Jeffrey Moore, who wrote a book called Crossing the Chasm. So basically had learned kind of strategy and strategic context from the McKenna Group. From there, I went to business school, then left and joined up with a few McKenna partners to do boutique consulting as well as some early stage investment. And based upon some of the stuff I was seeing, I kind of broke out and started a gaming studio working on social games back around 2010, 2011 or so, during the early days of social. And kind of did that as started off as a hobby, but then tried to do a company. And from there, after credits, that kind of killed social gaming. So then I tried to go into mobile, right place, right time in terms of like 2011 or so, in terms of trying to build a mobile game company. But I actually never, at that time, I didn't have a lot of operational experience. And so as a guy who had like a technology and strategy background and management consulting from my management consulting experience, I didn't really know how to motivate people about company culture, about anything, but tried to start a company at that time, failed, even though it was like the perfect time, the perfect place. I was not the right dude. And so was not very successful then. So after that, I basically did consulting for a number of Asian mobile game publishers like Smilegate and Renren Games. And then from there, I kind of jumped onto, I jumped in and worked at FunPlus in Beijing. And that's when I kind of put all the pieces together in terms of like having a technology background, kind of like a strategy background from my management consulting experience. And then really putting some of the operational lessons that I learned trying to start my own company at FunPlus, and then was able to have, a fairly big hit in King of Avalon. So that was like a big success on the studio development side. And after that, I left and joined Sega eventually becoming chief product officer for their mobile gaming division for the West. And then after that, joined NBC Universal, leading game publishing there. And then I don't know, about 3.5, 4 years ago, I started Lila Games, which is my attempt after all this time in kind of like the career I've had, getting older, thinking, man, wouldn't it be cool to try to do something meaningful with my life instead of just farting around and, working at companies where there's a lot of politics and nonsense? Wouldn't it be cool to try and build a company that actually had a kind of purpose and meaning and would be able to do something cool and very, very ambitious? So I wanted to take a shot at doing that, which is the kind of backstory behind founding Lila Games. And the context behind this company is that I felt that, going back to my studio days at FunPlus, that they had a model there in which they kind of took, at that time, although now they're much more experienced, but at that time, a fairly inexperienced team building mobile games, but brought in leads from around the world to Beijing and were then able to kind of develop and successfully launch pretty good products out of Beijing. And I'm trying to do the same thing in India. And India has a game development ecosystem that is fairly early and I would say unaccustomed to new game development for the global market. And so we're trying to do that here.
You left some really comfortable jobs to go, to go live the startup life. Sort of. Anything you miss from a bigger? I know you talked about politics of bigger organizations. Anything you miss about bigger organizations?
I miss not having to sell my Tesla stock every month to be able to cover my expenses. Yeah, I miss being able to invest and buy stuff. I miss being able to take vacations. I miss spending time with my family and my kids. And my kids used to be really far ahead academically. I have not spent time with them in a long time. And those are things. I mean, there's a cost, right? I think I think it's I mean, it's been well said that for anything really valuable, it requires sacrifice, and that's what I'm trying to do with my life. So there's you can't have it all, and so there is a cost to this. I am very appreciative, especially to my family, for accepting the sacrifice. And I think if I were married to somebody else, I mean, we've actually had a number of issues and conflicts because of this job, but certainly like it could have been a lot worse. And if she cared about money more, which she doesn't, then yeah, it makes no sense. What I'm doing right now makes absolutely no financial sense. So, yeah, there's certainly a lot of things I miss.
Yeah, no, look, this is amazing. And you commute between Bangalore and the West Coast, right?
Currently doing like 2 months here, 2 months back, going back and forth. And I would say that, going to some of the controversial topics that you had mentioned, that's one of the things where we're a little bit different in that I don't believe that for a new team, certainly if you're like a very experienced team, having worked together for many years, you're probably in a different situation. But for a new team working on new game development, I generally suggest, on site in office. And even when I'm doing this 2-2, when I'm back in the US, like I still work like crazy. I work all the freaking time. But the effectiveness in terms of the team, because I am not the team is here. And so, it's very difficult to like get alignment, get progress and things like that. And so we're certainly getting better at it, where there's a number of folks here that are developing, where we're building a stronger leadership and management layer here, but we're not there yet. So I would say that going back for 2 months is not ideal for me. And the longer that I could spend here, it's actually better and more effective and more efficient.
Another question before we talk about the present. You were behind a huge hit. You mentioned King of Avalon. In hindsight, what do you think made this game such a success? What was the recipe that worked for King of Avalon? It's so hard now to get a new game off the ground. So
When we were working on that game, I would say the vast majority of the team did not believe we would be successful. And at the start, I felt the same way. But I think I think you really do have to credit the success of the game to FunPlus' CEO, Andy Zong. Now, he may not have spent that much time on the game itself, but I would say he gave it enough resources. He brought in the right people to kind of deliver against the mission of making that game successful. And I would say, like, we did so many things wrong. And I think that when you think about a lot of game studios, I would say that if you look under the hood, most people would be shocked at how many screw ups, problems, mistakes, and things of that nature occur. I would say, and having been on the publisher side and having visited many, many studios, virtually all studios, like looking under the hood is a little bit scary. But I do think, like, in my experience, the studios that are successful often do a few things really right. And I would say, like, maybe the two biggest lessons I learned from both Andy and from Andy's co-founder Yitao were two things. First is optimism, that Andy he always believed. And I didn't believe initially, but he kind of convinced me to believe in the product. And I think that that level of optimism, especially when so many things are going wrong for a team, is very important. And then from Yital, what I learned was that, I used to be the guy who would point out a lot of problems. I call it the warner. This thing's messed up, this thing's messed up, this thing's messed up, this thing's messed up. But I wasn't super solutions oriented. And so one of the thing I learned from Yital was, like, don't just point out the problem, but go and fix it, right? Be more solutions oriented, be on the offense, not on the defense. And it doesn't help if you just talk about a problem. Like, you have to shift to an orientation towards spending 80% of your time fixing problems, 20% of your time or less talking about them, right? And so there's a lot of people at many companies that spend 99% of their time gossiping and talking about problems. Oh, Bill's like this, Sally's like this and that. That's all messed up. That's screwed up too. But, I would say the difference between the kind of people that move the needle and make a difference in a game studio are the ones who are oriented towards action and who are proactive instead of just like sitting there waiting for things to happen, or reactive and just really just spend their time gossiping and just talking about all the problems. That's not helpful. And so that was the biggest lesson I learned from Ito.
I can relate to that. At Epic, the culture was, if you see something, say something and do something. You're not, if something is broken, you're not just expected to point it out, but you're expected to contribute to the solution and do something about it.
Having worked in publishing with so many game studios, you would be shocked at the number of, of studios where that's just the default, right? Where the vast majority of the time is just spent talking about problems rather than focusing on solutions. And I strongly believe that so many teams would have dramatically higher rates of success if they can just fix that about their culture.
So let's talk about Lila. You raised a total of $13 million for the studio into rounds. In hindsight, fundraising is always a very, very bizarre moment in somebody's life where you have to pitch your work. So what stands out from this process in hindsight?
What stands out to me is that sometimes a few good decisions make up for hundreds of very bad decisions. And I would say the one good decision I made. So, we initially raised a seed round of 2.8 million. And I think, like, the thesis for us has always been long term. I've always told all of our investors, look, guys, if you're investing in us, we're going to India. Nobody knows anything here, right? Well, I mean, and I don't want to upset anybody, but like the maturity of the ecosystem here is not very mature. The kind, like, we have literally what's called a fresher, or like literally like fresh. We have like 5 fresh grads in very critical roles. And we have a lot of folks here who have never done it before. So we're literally training many people in the studio from zero. So for us, like, the focus has always been that we would be a long-term play. Now, after our seed round, we decided we need to raise more money because uh, I felt that developing in India was actually dramatically harder than I had thought. Like I thought, because I did it in China. I was like, oh yeah, yeah, we just do these. We just kind of set this stuff up. We hire these people, but like the people we're able to find were not as skilled as the folks we had available in China. And we actually had a huge recruiting department. And I would say that's one of the things that FunPlus did really well is like the recruiting was on fire. That was solid. Always bringing in candidates and able to like get people. I'm having to spend over half my time on recruiting, reaching out to people directly, as well as training, as well as being, on top of a lot of stuff here, and everything's on fire. So I would say like the path towards getting to where we needed to be was a lot longer. The availability of talent wasn't as abundant as in China. We decided we need to raise more money, but at that time, everybody told us don't raise too much, raise as little as possible. And I was told quite distinctly that if you're a great entrepreneur, you can raise in any environment. And what I told one of our investors at that time was, well, I'm not a great entrepreneur, so I'm going to try to raise as much as I can now. And it was a good thing we did because because if I didn't do that, we'd be out of business right now because we are a long-term play and we have had so many problems. And I think we are starting to turn the corner no, I'm sure we're going to have more challenges and different kinds of challenges moving forward, but different challenges. And I think a lot of the really massive major problems are hopefully behind us, where we've got other problems that we're going to be dealing with moving forward. But, we've got about, half our cash left. And we still do have a pretty decent runway, but now we're kind of in a new phase in our company. But back to the fundraising question, if I didn't raise that much, we would have been screwed. I mean, it would have literally been game over for us.
Because raising today is much more difficult.
There have been rules that we've had to turn over like many, many times. And just finding the right people here has been extremely difficult.
And as a CEO, one of your role is to create culture. So you studied in India, places where there is no pre-established gaming culture. So I came across a deck that you published that exposes your corporate culture and your company values with a clear call out: if it doesn't work for you, do not apply or do not work for us. I found it was very very, very good. Do you remember some of those elements that are in their deck to share with our audience here?
I basically looked at a lot of the lessons that I learned from other successful entrepreneurs and saw read or studied what they did. But then also through my experience in development from my previous background, as well as on the publisher side and seeing what other game studios have done and what has made them successful, that has kind of formed the kind of values that I believe that we needed to succeed. But there's a number of values there, and I actually I'm working on an updated version of that, Mark, just so you know, which I'll hopefully publish in the next few weeks. But things like having a wartime orientation, addressing problems, as I mentioned, which we kind of touched upon before. I won't go through all of them just because I think it'll eat up a lot of airtime. But for anyone interested, feel free to just go to lilagames.com. It's right there. There were in that deck, I believe there were 8 values, and again, one of the things that I'm working on now is a update to those values, which I'll publish shortly.
That was a lot of my experience when first at Epic Games. I mean, I think you'll find this kind of open and direct communication, this notion of radical truth and debate. It was always important. Clear areas of responsibilities is also something. I mean, it's fun. It sounds obvious, but I was reflecting upon that. It's true that in an environment where there is less pressure, those tend to be second rank values, and the managing of the day to day and the politics and the relationship in the organization seems to take over. So
Yeah, I would say that for me, I just think that stating those values clearly for people will basically help you because like it doesn't serve your company if you have somebody who's not aligned who then joins, and then based upon the misalignment, then you have to let them go or things like that. And so I just believe in just putting that out there and being as clear as possible on how you plan to operate, because those values in my view really kind of serve as the operating system for the company, right? It's like it dictates how you're going to interact with other people, how you're going to act at the company. And every company is going to have a little bit of a different view and perspective. One of the values that I think, I'm not sure is in that version, but in the newer version is called character and cruelty, meaning we do, I believe, need to be kind of
Cruelty.
cruelty, yeah, character and cruelty. But yeah, it's just in my opinion, it's just like will help people understand and make a determination of whether this is the organization for them. And I think that the good news is that there are a lot of different kind of companies out there. And I think it's better if people had more information so they can make the right choice for themselves. I mean, in this life that we live, time is so precious. And so if you spend time at a company where you're fundamentally misaligned with how they want to operate, it's so inefficient, and it's gonna waste your time. It's gonna waste the company's time. And so just I would strongly advocate for anybody if you're a founder or if you're responsible for this kind of thing at your company, to just really make it clear to people who are applying so that you just save a lot of time, and it's just more efficient.
So now, tell us a little bit about the games you're building. I think it's called Project Black. Get us excited about it.
We're working on two games. We actually just started working on a second game, but I would say that when you think about, and just to step back, when you think about India, the way that we think about opportunity in India for gaming is in two parts. The first part is the Indian gaming development ecosystem, which comprises all of the makers here in India and the kind of people that we want to recruit and work with us to build games. And that would be building games for the global market. In the second part of India is like the game market, India's gaming market, right? And so it's all the players and the people in India. And so we started this company trying to leverage the India game development ecosystem to find people that would make games for the global market. And so the first game that we're developing is an extraction shooter, which I can go into more details about. And the second game, which we just started, is a dating simulation game for the Indian market. So we're actually trying to go after both now. And as far as like extraction shooter, I would say that we kind of decided to build that game on kind of like two basic premises, right? And like the first is that for mobile games, that compulsion and progression is just as important as gameplay. And the second kind of premise or thesis that we believed in is that in mobile, distribution is all about ARPU, so your LTV, and so monetization is critically important. And so based upon those two theses, and based upon what we believed could help us get better distribution for mobile in terms of like understanding the shooter market and the nuances of that market, because it is so competitive, that kind of formed the kind of game that we wanted to create. And so when you think about the competitive dynamics in shooter, because it is so saturated, we felt like we needed a what we call a strange attractor, meaning you take something novel and something familiar and you kind of mix those together. That kind of formed the basis of like our art style and some of our visual pillars for the game. I think that when I talk about compulsion and progression, that kind of informed the kind of game that we wanted, a stateful game that would help you with progression. It also informed the fact that we not only have like a gameplay and combat component to our game, but we also have like this social MMO side to the game. Because what we wanted to do is we want to embed a number of progression vectors in this social MMO space, because we really wanted like a very visual and visceral kind of experience for players that gives them a reason to go into the combat and the gameplay. And we knew that building out of India, we're not going to be able to compete in terms of like the gameplay itself. We don't think we're going to be able to make a game that plays better than Call of Duty Mobile. And so we feel like we need to be good enough there, but then really just orienting the game around not just the gameplay, but also the systems and having great or interesting compulsion and progression mechanics. And on the monetization side, because we believe that for us, distribution equals ARPU, that we've built a number of systems in terms of collection and upgrading and things like that, crafting and other things, so that we can potentially try to increase monetization so that we can compete against other shooter games in the market. And it also led to our decision for extraction, right? Because like if you think about the main forms of monetization in a lot of shooters today, it's largely cosmetics driven, like a cosmetics driven battle pass of some kind. But what extraction gives you,
Can you explain what extraction is for everybody, just to make sure that people follow you there?
just to set the context for people who don't know anything about shooter, there's basically like two primary game modes that are successful in the market today. One is team deathmatch, meaning you have like 4v4, 5v5, or 6v6. So you've got two different teams that battle each other for number of kills, or whoever kills the other side. And you have battle royale, which is popularized by Fortnite. You have 100 players. There's like a shrinking map based upon a storm, and then there's eventually one survivor who wins, and that winner feels great. But it's not stateful, meaning the things that you get in the game you don't keep. Now, in an extraction shooter, basically what happens is you extract into a map, and you can go and scavenge and collect stuff, but you'll be able to keep it. And there's generally like one big prize, like an airdrop or something at the end that you can get. And so, but the things that you get and when you extract from the map back to your base or whatever, you keep that stuff. So it's stateful. Now, one of the interesting things that we thought about with extraction is that you can have different you can have different starting points in the sense that, Mark, you might come into the game with a mega gun and I might come in with a pistol. But because these things are at risk, meaning there's stakes involved, that we felt that we could kind of use free to play mechanics to try to make that a little bit more interesting. But one of the things that you see with Western players is they really care about fairness. And so one of the big bets is that you can have asymmetric gameplay in terms of like the loadout that you start with, because they're at risk. And so that's one of the things that we'll find out if it works or not once we launch.
I have a question about the dating game, because it looks like those games pertain to culture, and it looks to me like India is not one culture; it's a mosaic of culture. I mean, how do you go about addressing such a vast? Great News is a big market, but it seems to be a mosaic of cultures.
It's a little bit of a challenge to really understand how to best optimize a game based upon the number of different languages. And to your point, India is almost like a bunch of different countries brought together. But I think, kind of some of our choices are to go with, from a language perspective, Hinglish, which is like Hindi plus English. And we're certainly targeting certain demographics. Or actually, we're about to enter our concept testing phase. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this game is to be very market driven, where we're kind of trying to very, very similar to companies like Century Games, where they do a lot of early market testing, in where you're actually doing a lot of your UA testing, things of that nature, before you develop the game. So we're doing that for this game now. And so we've developed a number of concepts, we've written a bunch of treatments, and now we're about to enter a phase shortly where we test those concepts in market. And based upon that, that'll determine the kind of game that we make.
I brought you in because I wanted to talk about a little bit the state of the game industry. It's, our audience is not familiar, but before that, I want to talk about you a little bit more. I mean, you are, startup CEO. You're very dedicated to your organization, but you also take a lot of time to give back to the community, and you have a number of activities as a content creator. You're a very prolific content creator. The Game Makers podcast is actually a fabulous resource if you want to know about what's going on about the game industry with you always bring on some really interesting people. I mean, I did listen to the GDC wrap up, which I felt was on the nose in terms of my experience at GDC and the current state of the industry. I think you're part of the Disconstructor of Fun family as well.
I was. So I started the podcast, the Deconstructor of Fun This Week in Games podcast. But I left that podcast, I don't know, a couple of years ago, a year or two ago. I forgot when. So I'm not doing much with the Deconstructor guys anymore. But I hear it's doing well. So good.
So tell me about game makers.
Yeah, sure. So like in terms of the content, I develop content for a couple of reasons. One is that I think for any startup CEO, one of the primary objectives is recruiting. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to send out a bat signal for people who were interested in game development topics and in which we could potentially market to them. And in fact, I basically, like here at our company today, I asked our top 5 employees, how did you find out about Lila? Why did you join the company? All 5 of them came in through a LinkedIn post about some content that I had posted, or they were already subscribed to Game Makers in some way. And so, it's been very helpful from a recruitment perspective. But also, I think the other reason why I develop content is because I want to be very thoughtful, because I do think like the gaming industry is so dynamic, it changes so much, and it is so complicated that I want to make sure that I'm on top of any major changes or difficult issues or topics. And so by having this platform where I'm able to discuss in effect, really just all the issues that I care about, right? And so, for example, when I was not sure about UA, I would do podcasts on UA. When I was fundraising, I would do podcasts on fundraising. When I have issues around specific development or production issues, then I would do a podcast on those issues. And so for me, it's been very helpful, because I think that by having that kind of a platform and having like an excuse to be able to talk to very smart people about some of the problems that I'm thinking about, that it's been helpful for me to kind of understand those topics in a better way, and being able to speak with people who are truly experts in those specific areas.
But through the newsletter, through the podcast, you cover so many topics. How do you stay on top of all of those things? This is incredible.
I'm just very curious about all that stuff. And so for me, I feel like, those are a lot of things that I need to know as competing in a market that is so competitive. And for me, it's just interesting. So I love talking about that stuff. I don't have a lot of hobbies, and, I don't have a lot of free time, but those are things where that's kind of like my hobby is learning about those things.
So you let me put you on the spot here. You recently did an episode on two important companies in the gaming industry called Ubisoft and Brayer. What was your takeaway in a nutshell to get people?
There were a couple of things I did on Ubisoft. There was one where I got a lot of hate, but it went kind of viral, where I talked about bookings per revenue and kind of efficiency. It was kind of timely, because when we talked about Embracer, we did talk about one of the things that came up is like, where is the synergy here with all these companies together, right? I think that was a key point that Matthew Conterman was keying in on. And, we kind of came to the conclusion that maybe there isn't enough synergy. And literally the week after, they announced a split. So I think that's probably something worth revisiting. But I would say, like, when I think about Embracer, I think that for me, it represents a fundamental question about where the games industry is headed, right? Like Zynga, for example, if you look at the history of Zynga, they, for the most part, for about, I don't know, the past 10 years have been virtually all of their growth has come through M&A. And there is a strategy and a synergy that made sense for them to roll all those companies together. In Embracer's case, it didn't make sense. So, one of the things that I think about from an Embracer perspective is, when do you bundle? When do you unbundle? what are synergies that make sense and what are synergies that are just not there, so it doesn't make sense, right? And so for me, that's just like one of these strategic questions. And certainly, I think that going all the way back to the nature of the firm, which was the paper that talked about why do you have a company? Why does a company exist? And the thinking is that when you have all these like external transaction costs that don't make sense, and so you bring that internally. Maybe not to go too deep on that, but like I do think there is going to be a fundamental reevaluation now about what kinds of combinations and acquisitions make sense in today's market for gaming. What is like the ideal size of a company? Do small companies become more competitive, or do bigger companies become more competitive? And so I think when I think about those two companies that we covered on the Embracer side, that's the key question that I'm thinking about. And on the Ubisoft side, that is really a question about efficiency, right? And so when we look at, again, bookings per employee, and they're dead last of any major public company, it speaks to, for me, whether that model is sustainable, especially in the context of a lot of capabilities that are being developed in China, where you have these companies like HoYoverse, MiHoYo, Lilith, Game Science, and these companies that are, you know, not only more efficient, but they're working 996. And so that to me raises a question, what does the competitive landscape look like? And how do companies like that, are they going to survive, or like, how do they survive if they maintain that structure? So for me, like the reason why I like speaking to guys like Matthew and Brian about these topics is, one, I learn a lot about like the financial side. And so, if we were ever to go public, I think that would be good for me to learn. But also, it helps me really think a little bit more deeply about some of these strategic issues that, and I've got, a couple of smart guys to talk through these issues with.
I do believe there are good proxies of what we're seeing going in the PC gaming industry right now. I think, Ubisoft for me, the epitome of the traditional ways of building AAA games. And as you said, I think it's getting more difficult for them given all the market changes. So let's switch to mobile. I think. Do you want to tell us what happened with IDFA and what happened in this market? I think it's good to look back at that. The decision that Apple made around the tracking.
Sure. I mean, I think this topic can go pretty long or deep. So maybe I could just do a very cursory explanation. But IDFA, which is ID for advertisers, basically got deprecated on Apple's side. And basically that IDFA, helps game studios track users and track all the activities of a specific user. And more importantly, like spend by that user. And what that allows you to do by having IDFA is when you're advertising, you can try and target very high value spenders. And based upon some of the capabilities, based upon machine learning that Facebook made, like the kind of UA campaigns that you had through Facebook and then Google, in terms of targeting those high value players, it became very very lucrative for those guys. But then you can really do a lot of targeting, which you are not supposed to be able to do, but you can still do because of something called fingerprinting. And so I would say, like, the big thing to take away is that if you have a high LTV game, you're able to target those high spenders, and basically acquire those spenders. But in the absence of targeting, the advertising becomes more broad based. And I think the net effect of this, without going into too much, because I can tell I'm like, I don't want to lose the audience here, but like the net effect of this is that without something like IDFA or fingerprinting, then I think the net effect of this, my theory has been that games that monetize really strongly like Forex and social casino will decline. In games like Supercell games that have higher conversion but lower ARPU will likely win. And I think that the net effect should be positive because when you think about it, like what happens when you take away IDFA and basic a lot of these very sophisticated machine learning and kind of AI based targeting capabilities is that you're taking margin away from those advertisers and giving it back to players and developers. So overall, I think it's probably a good thing, but winners and losers will shift. And the current state of the industry is that fingerprinting may get deprecated. I think based upon Apple's policy, they don't want you to do fingerprinting, but they haven't like started banning apps that have SDKs from whether it's Unity or App 11 or others that still do fingerprinting.
There was a number of decisions there that really, as you said, changed the landscape for mobile games. Probably for good. Probably for the probably shifting more attention to the hands of I would say legit developers and people who are actually trying to compete on gameplay and the good attributes of game development, such as yourself. So
Well, we'll see what happens too, because like the whole fingerprinting thing, I don't think the hammers come down, and I'm not sure if it will come down. I mean, I just don't know. And then there are potential workarounds, even if Apple fully bans fingerprinting. But so I'm just kind of guessing. A lot of people think that a lot of the ad companies are going to be fine. I'm one of the few that thinks that it's going to be a problem, but we'll see.
actually, it has been a problem for Unity. I think a very, very public problem. And since a few days ago, Unity has a new CEO that joined from Zynga. Do you have any recommendation for him? I heard your podcast. You had some good insight on that company.
Look, I don't know who that guy is, but a few people who have said that they have worked with him say that he's actually great at operations, which is the kind of person that they need. So in theory, I would say that that's probably good news for Unity. But I do think there probably needs to be a little bit of a cultural shift at Unity. And I do think they've got to become a lot more focused on execution and around being developer friendly. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, we wish him good luck. I think we have so many industry friends at Unity, so we want them to be happy and successful. So let's switch back. I mean, you have Matthew Canterman in your podcast, and we had Ion from Super Social here a few times ago. So one of the big thing is the new platform like UEFN, Unreal Editor for Fortnite, and Roblox. Would you ever see those platforms become viable for a studio like yours?
I would say like the economics of a hit mobile game versus a hit Roblox game. The economics are, the potential outcomes are much higher for just like a standalone mobile game. But when you look at a company like Century Games, they also have a top Roblox game in addition to having hit mobile games. I would say probably the vast majority of that revenue comes from their mobile side versus Roblox. But I do think that it might be good for some game companies to experiment with Roblox and UEFN just to get into the habit of just speed and and understanding what is successful on those platforms, because I do think that when you see some of the success there, that could potentially be leveraged into a standalone mobile game. I know that there was I had done a podcast with Pete Hawley, who was at 100 Thieves, and that was part of the thesis. I'm not sure if it panned out or not, but at 100 Thieves, at least before, they kind of had this view that they would be doing stuff on UEFN, but then also having a mobile game dev studio that would take lessons learned from their experience on UEFN and potentially turning that into a standalone mobile game.
Last two things of interest to us here. Web3 gaming, it looks like it's still there. There's still some part of the market interesting. Do you have a point of view on that aspect of it?
Actually, that's an area I've done very little. Like I tried to learn all the crypto and web gaming stuff way back, and I tried to learn more about it, but don't know much about it. I do know that the one advantage that they have is just dramatically high, ARPU. And so if there's something that you can do with that, great. I think the thing that I worry about is that there's just a limited number of wallets out there, right? And so how many of the wallets are actual players versus speculators? So that again, I just don't know that market well enough. But I have heard when I was at GDC, I did hear that Web3 games are sort of back to some degree, and that there have been some recent, I don't know, I think they call them mints that have done really well. So, good for them. I personally hope they do well. I hope that they're able to figure some stuff out, but I just personally don't have a lot of experience or expertise there.
No, it's the same. I mean, we observe that there's some interesting characteristic to Web3 gaming, but we need good games, and we haven't still yet. Maybe Shrapnel from Mark Long is going to be one of those. We'll see. It should be out relatively soon now. And finally, one thing that's more important to me, or to and to us here in this podcast, we talk a lot about the web becoming a viable 3D platform through standardization. That's one thing. We're seeing a lot of web going on in e-commerce. We're seeing through GLTF and OpenUSD. We're starting to see a full 3D ecosystem developing itself around the web. So what about web and instant gaming? I mean, it looks like improvement like web GPU, web assembly. We're starting to bring a level of performance to browsers with the recent upgrade. Do you see where you were at GDC? Did you come across interesting thing in terms of instant gaming and web based?
I remember this is way back in like 2011 or 2012, where I was introduced to Trip Hawkins. And I remember just getting on a call with him, and he spent like an hour and a half uh, just talking to me about how, in the end, the web browser is the console, is the everything. Everything's going to go to the web browser. I mean, we quite haven't gotten there yet. Maybe we do in the future. I mean, I do think that there's a web browser everywhere, right? Every PC, every mobile device, and so maybe.
It's also monetization right now. You get the virality of being able to invite somebody in a game session with a URL, which is very positive, but discovery and business models are still to be figured out.
I just think in general, trying to fight Apple is a losing battle. I think, trying to get games through web that then bypasses the App Store is I think they're going to figure out some way to like not let that happen. And when you think about how many people cannot give up their iPhones, right? And I think I remember hearing a statistic that over 80% of people here in the U.S. anyway want their next phone to be an iPhone. So I just yeah, I would say maybe the technology finally gets there, which I don't think it's there today. But if it finally does, then I think then you got to deal with, how do you get that past Apple?
All right. Well, I did not warn you about this, but the usual last question in this podcast is to give a shout out to a person, an organization, or an institution that matters to you.
I want to give a shout out to basically. So I recently did a podcast on a show called WTF Is, and basically the podcast was done by, I mean, it's hosted by this guy. I think he's like India's youngest billionaire, but his name is Nikhil Kamath. But he's just a really really good dude, like humble, super interesting podcast. It is a little bit with an India focus, but I would highly recommend checking out his YouTube channel or podcast. It's called WTF Is, and I just think he's just a really great guy, doing good things in the world. And I think he already has one of the most popular podcasts in the world and a very popular YouTube channel. But I think more people should be aware of him because he's just awesome.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I also, talking about good guys doing good things for the world, I want to thank you for being with us today, but also want to thank you for all of that content that you create for the Game Makers podcast. All those things, it's really helpful, certainly to me, to keep to keep a pulse on what's going in the gaming industry. So I encourage everybody to find you on various platforms. You seem to be on many of them. Any pointer you want to give us today? What's the main point of entry in the world of GK?
Go to gamemakers.com, and that's like the newsletter, and then that should have links to the YouTube and the podcast. So yeah, I would say go there.
So Joseph, your unwavering pursuit of excellence and conviction into your beliefs continues to shape the gaming industry in very profound ways. So I want to thank you for being with us today. And yeah, thank you so much. We'll thank you to our ever-growing audience, and we will be back soon for another episode of Building the Open Metaverse. Thank you so much. Thank you, GK. It was an honor to have you with us.